Hey guys, welcome back. So now we're getting back into Miles Morales' Spider-Man. So where this run for the most part is very much your friendly neighborhood, street level / high school type of story for Miles. And with that is led Miles into this investigation of finding these missing children, which in this case is very personal to Miles, but it's also very much a job for Spider-Man, which is really tough for Miles because he's still really maturing in both areas. So let's get into it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so jumping right back into where at this point your unlikely team up of Miles Morales and the Rhino, which does seem unlikely on the surface, but I feel like it's one of those things for the Rhino, which makes more sense than people realize, especially with the origin of his transformation and becoming the Rhino originally being something that he did for his family. So with that being the case, it makes sense that he would do all of this to try to find his niece. But even still, with him having such a big heart, intelligence wise he's about as sharp as a bowling ball. But with him helping Miles out, he's at least able to do the legwork while Miles is at school, and together they were at least able to figure out that Tombstone is behind the case of these missing children, which they discovered by finding one of his hideouts. But with doing this and finding some of the kids, from here Miles not only has to figure out what they're going to do with the kids that they found, but also where the other kids, including Eduardo and the Rhino's niece, and this is something he has to figure out because he's clearly the brains of this operation, and on top of that, lead detective if you will on this street level case. But it's also at this time when they're met with the arrival of Captain America, who lets Miles know that he doesn't have to do this alone and he's here to help. And Cap is mainly here because he was contacted by his congresswoman, Marisol Hatana Montes, and she had called Cap in for his help because on her end she knew the kids were being taken from immigration, and in the background she's doing the fighting on the legal side to try to get these children back to their families. But before we go further, I want to take a minute and talk about the elephant in the room, and after that we'll come back here and talk about the Rhino that's in the room. Because with addressing the elephant, Captain America and Miles, they have met before prior to this point. But in no way do I want anyone to confuse this with your alternate Steve Rogers from Secret Empire. Because not only was that a different Cosmic Cube, Red Skull, curated Steve Rogers, but with as terrible as that Steve Rogers was within Secret Empire and the history of where things went between Miles and that Steve Rogers, in no way did it mess up the perspective on either end between your real Captain America and his perspective of Miles Morales, or even in the case of Miles Morales and how he felt about the real Captain America. And really it feels like in an unspoken way, because the both of them beat the brakes off America's asshat.
Watch your language, okay?
Oh, what language? Yeah. Said hat.
It really gives Miles and your OG Captain America a bit of your unspoken mutual feeling of, okay, I like the way this guy thinks. But when Captain America shows up here, of course Secret Empire and Civil War II, none of that's the conversation, but when Cap arrives and he lets Miles know that he's gonna follow his lead, it's like right off the bat, Cap trusts Miles' judgment and he only wants to contribute to the progress which Miles has made in finding a solution for helping these kids. But there is a bit of a moment where Cap is suspicious of Rhino being there, but Cap dismisses it shortly after when Miles vouches for him. But with the three of them working together, Miles then points out that the tracks leaving this place, whether they be from Tombstone or whoever he was working with, that there's a certain set in particular that's covered with a strange residue. And immediately Cap is like, hey, I got something for that, because prior to this at some point Tony had given him a modified smartphone which is capable of scanning different materials and running them back to one of Tony's labs, and after that it would then update Cap on what type of material it is. But of course with Cap not being too tech savvy, he isn't too familiar on how to operate the phone, let alone how to get to the application so he can scan these tracks and see what it is. But fortunate enough, Miles is much younger, so he takes the phone from Cap, who prior to looks like he was trying to split atoms, which makes me think like I can imagine what Cap would do when he sees this screen on the phone. Which makes sense for Cap, because when you wake up in a world that's highly advanced from where you left it, and on top of that the rate of which it advances, that then spikes every few years. So for Cap, it makes sense that it's pretty tough to keep up with all this. But when Miles helps him out and he scans the tracks, they then find out that the tracks are mainly covered with diesel fuel and canal water. And immediately they both knew that these tracks had come from Gowanus in South Brooklyn, and mainly because both of them were born and raised in Brooklyn. Which in Miles' case, you know, his Brooklyn a little different though. But with learning this, it does catch Cap off guard a little bit, because he's like, wait, I thought you were from Queens. But of course Miles is like, nope, that's the other guy. But after this, when they followed the clues back to the Gowanus Canal, It then leads him to an old warehouse which used to be a containment facility for mutants many years ago, which at the time was set up by S.H.I.E.L.D., but at this point with there being no S.H.I.E.L.D., this place is supposed to be shut down. But instead of that being the case, it's a packed house. And at this point with Rhino just ready to go down there, smack a couple people upside the head and find out where's his niece, Cap then tells the both of them that they need to go down there with a plan. And most importantly because there's children involved, and for that reason they need to be careful so none of these children are hurt. But also with saying this, Cap then looks to Miles and he asks him, so Miles, what's the plan? And initially when this happens, it just catches Miles off guard. And mainly because he looks up to Cap, but also once again like we've seen him write in his journals, he's still really in a place of trying to plant his feet into being a hero, on top of figuring that out with life altogether. And the crazy thing is, like, we've seen Miles not only be a great hero, but also step into that leadership role in other occasions times before. And in this moment he's open with Cap, like he admits that he knows that there's been times where he saved the universe, which is very much like what we'd seen with Spider-Geddon, but in this moment with it being a bit more personal, Miles admits that he's having a harder time because for him it's easier to save someone who doesn't have a face or a name versus going in and trying to save someone who you personally know you don't want them to get hurt. And it's in this moment where Cap does his speech thing, you know, which he's good at, and he more or less tells Miles that either way it's the same because in either situation that person needs you. And on top of that, he reassures Miles that he's been doing great so far, and for that reason just to move forward, continue, and keep doing what you're doing. And that's exactly what Miles does, because in this case he goes with a plan that's similar to what him and Rhino had did, where Miles does stealth recon and Rhino was essentially the backup. But he also let them know like, hey, if you guys hear anything, just rush down there. But of course with Miles going down there, like immediately things started popping off. Because right away, one of the missing kids with the enhancement suits, they attack Miles, so of course Cap and Rhino rush in. But what's funny in the case of like Rhino, in the case of defending themselves from these kids, Rhino kind of has a real moment. And it's kind of relatable because if you've ever been like play fighting with a little kid and they hurt you for real, like if we're being honest, like in that situation, there's this real moment where you gotta make a decision. Because though you've turned your play punches down to like 2%, in this moment there's a part of you that kind of wants to turn it up to like 40%. And right now that's where Rhino's head's at. But in this moment Miles and Cap gotta remind the Rhino that bro, you the Rhino. And 40% of 100 tons of brute strength, it's still a lot. But not long after this, they come across the guy who's been mind controlling these children, who's a dude who goes by the name of the Snatcher. And immediately Miles and Cap is like, man, this dude is suspect on an Omega level. But immediately after hearing his name, they're like, okay, we heard enough, we're about to just beat the brakes out of this guy. But before they can, he uses his mind control to attack Rhino, Cap, and Miles. And when he uses his mind snatching on adults versus small children, it's a different effect. Because though children, they just become obedient, but for adults, it's more like a lethal mind melting attack. But when this happens, in the case of Cap, he gives the Snatcher the hardest time with mentally just trying to resist his attack. And when this happens, the Snatcher then focuses more energy on Cap, which then frees Rhino and Miles, which gives Rhino the opportunity to try to lead the children away, but it also gives Miles the chance to go after the Snatcher. And I love that when this happens, like Miles literally tells him like, you finna catch these hands, which he does deliver promptly in order to take the Snatcher down. But when this happens, in a last-ditch effort from the Snatcher, like out of desperation, he then threatens Miles and the others by making the children turn on each other. And when this happens, Rhino sees his niece Tanya out of the group, and immediately Miles spots Eduardo front and center. But also with this happening, the kids then try to resist the mind control from the Snatcher, much like what they've seen with Cap, as well as Rhino and Miles getting free. And because the Snatcher draws strength from adults and he gives orders to children, he uses his strength to break out of Miles' web, and when he sees the kids resisting the mind control, he then uses more of that strength to attack their minds right away. Which is really messed up, because if your power is to control children like in the first place, like how about you just don't? But when Miles sees the Snatcher turn it up on these kids, Miles is pretty much like, okay, oh, you want to turn it up? So he charges his Venom Blast, punches the Snatcher in the stomach, and snatched the wind about that man's body. And I'm gonna tell you right now, if you ever seen someone get KO'd from a punch to the stomach, like I never thought that was possible until I seen like Roy Jones do it to someone a long time ago. And I remember when I seen it, I was like, he punched him in the stomach, now he's asleep. That's crazy. But with Miles doing it here, it essentially was just him keeping his word of telling dude he was gonna catch these hands, so that at least now from this point, the Snatcher can never say that Spider-Man's a liar. But after this, Cap then calls his congresswoman, who immediately works on getting these kids back to their parents, and in the case of some of these kids who are just homeless, she also works on finding them a new home. But also from here, Cap gets a call from the Avengers, which at this point in time calls for him to leave to Romania to take care of a vampire problem with all of this occurring around Avengers issue 14. But after wrapping all this up, it's also 4:30 in the morning, so Miles has to hurry back to his room and quickly figure out what sleep is so he can get to class the next day. And not the next day, but like in a few hours. But back in class, he's approached by Barbara, who you can tell got a full night's sleep. But at this point, Barbara lets Miles know that Eduardo's back home safe, and later on that evening, she's taking him to a slasher movie to cheer him up, which kind of has Miles like, okay, you gonna take him to a murder movie? Like, okay. But Barbara tells him it's what he wanted to do, so she agreed just to get his mind off of being kidnapped by a supervillain. But that part she tells Miles he wouldn't necessarily know about unless he was Spider-Man, which is ironic because Miles knows everything about it because he is Spider-Man. But she just brushes over it and tells Miles that he should come with. But it's also in this moment where Miles gets the idea for his journal entry to where he's realizing that he's learned that these threats that pale in comparison to like your world-ending events, that they're just as important because of the people who are involved. Which on the flip side is why I like a lot of these smaller stories, because the character or the people, they're the most important part of any story. Whether it seems to be the end of a universe, or if it's even just making sure a bunch of kids get home safe. Because at the end of the day, every story doesn't have to be end all be all, Omega Infinity, part 10. Because at that point, every hero will be like, oh, here we go again. Because they would just be jaded from going through it so many times. And as readers, we would too. So now real quick, I just want to give a shout out to all the Patreons. Thank you guys for all of your support. And for anyone who's new here or anyone who's been here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link in the description to where you can head to patreon.com/Dopespill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. But as we continue with the Miles Morales Spider-Man playlist, I do like that for the most part that it's centered around more of your grounded type situations. And there's a couple parts that stretch beyond that later on, but we'll get to that. But let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again on the next one. Alright, later.